Imagine waking up one morning, wrapped in the comfort of your home, the smell of coffee brewing, the soft hum of life around you, and believing everything in your world is exactly as it should be. Now, imagine returning from a routine errand, expecting the laughter, warmth, and presence of the person you trusted most, only to find that they are gone. Completely gone. Not a note, not a message, not a single word. Just emptiness where love once lived. That, according to Trevor Engelson, is exactly what happened to him when Meghan Markle, the woman he married and trusted, simply disappeared. Overnight. No warning. No goodbye. Nothing but a FedEx box containing the wedding ring he thought would last forever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. You might be asking yourself, how does someone vanish from a marriage like that? How can the person you promised forever with, the person you built a life around, leave without so much as a whispered explanation? Trevor Engelson has spent the last 12 years trying to understand it himself. 12 years of questions, of sleepless nights, of imagining what could have been. And now he's finally speaking out. And what he reveals is shocking, disturbing, and, for many, almost unbelievable. This story isn't just about celebrity gossip. It's about the human experience of betrayal, the raw pain of being abandoned, and the complicated intersection of love and ambition. Trevor's story matters now because Meghan's life has changed dramatically since that day, moving from a Hollywood actress to royalty, marrying Prince Harry, and capturing global attention. But what happened before that transformation? What led to this sudden vanishing act that left a man reeling, humiliated, and heartbroken? That is the story we are about to uncover. Trevor tells it in his own words, and the details he shares are haunting. He recalls the day he received the FedEx box. He remembers the weight of it in his hands, the cold metal of the ring inside, and the realization that the person he loved had chosen a sudden and absolute departure over a conversation, over closure, over the simple dignity of saying goodbye. He says, "I didn't get a goodbye, I got a FedEx box." Think about that for a moment. Imagine your entire world being reduced to a cardboard package and a few cold words written on a piece of paper. The betrayal isn't just in the leaving. It's in the method, in the precision, in the utter disregard for emotional connection. And yet, it didn't start there. To understand the depth of what happened, we have to go back to the beginning, to the whirlwind romance that captured hearts, that seemed so perfect in every sense. Trevor and Meghan met at a time when both were ambitious, passionate, and dreaming big. There were romantic dinners, late-night conversations, laughter that seemed endless, and plans that stretched into forever. Their connection was electric, a combination of chemistry and shared ambition. Friends described them as inseparable. Admirers saw a Hollywood couple destined for fame and admiration. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Small disagreements that seemed trivial at the time, subtle signals of ambition pulling them in different directions, and differences in communication styles that would later become chasms. Trevor, in interviews, recalls moments when he sensed a distance, moments where Meghan seemed preoccupied, distant, or otherwise engaged in thoughts that didn't include him. And yet, he never imagined that this distance would escalate into a full disappearance. Here's where it becomes almost unimaginable. Imagine your spouse vanishing while the world continues spinning. Trevor wasn't just dealing with personal heartbreak. He was navigating the maze of speculation, rumors, and the gossip that Hollywood seems to breed effortlessly. Friends would call, family would inquire, and yet no answers were forthcoming. All the while, Meghan was taking steps in her life that would soon make global headlines. The timing was almost too precise to ignore, suggesting, as Trevor implies, that this wasn't a sudden whim but a decision executed with calculated efficiency. Think about the psychology of this. For 12 years, Trevor carried the unanswered questions, the replayed conversations in his mind, the scenarios of what he could have done differently. There's a particular kind of torment that comes from not knowing. Closure is not just an emotional luxury. It's a necessity for healing. Trevor's FedEx box wasn't closure. It was the opposite. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had no beginning for him anymore. And now, decades later, he's telling the world exactly what that experience felt like. The fear, the humiliation, and the shock of being so completely left behind. Yet, there's more to this story than heartbreak alone. There is a human fascination with the choices people make when faced with ambition and opportunity. Trevor suggests that Meghan's departure was not solely about leaving him. It was about leaving love behind for a spotlight that had already begun to shine in Hollywood and, eventually, in the British royal family. Imagine making a choice where you walk away from stability, from affection, from loyalty, because the allure of fame and influence is simply too strong. That tension between personal connection and ambition is something many people understand, yet few experience on this scale. The stakes in Trevor's story are enormous because the person involved would later become one of the most scrutinized public figures in the world. What makes this revelation even more compelling is how it reframes the public narrative we thought we knew. For years, media outlets speculated about Meghan's rise, her relationships, and her ambitions. But Trevor provides a perspective that had never been shared before. It's a glimpse into private life, a human, emotional reality behind the polished images, the interviews, and the headlines. When he says she just disappeared, he isn't exaggerating. He means it literally. One day she was there, the next she wasn't, leaving him, and only him, to reconcile the unimaginable. And so, as we dive into this story, we have to ask ourselves difficult questions. How do you reconcile love with betrayal? How do you understand someone who chooses ambition over intimacy? Can heartbreak ever truly fade when the manner of departure is so shocking, so calculated, and so absolute? These are the questions that will guide us through the next hour, as we examine Trevor Engelson's perspective, the details he shares, and the larger truths about love, fame, and human behavior that his story illuminates. Trevor also hints at moments during their marriage that foreshadowed this exit, subtle signs, behaviors that seemed inconsequential at the time, but were actually part of a pattern. Moments when Meghan prioritized work, when she seemed distracted, when small decisions began to signal a growing distance. The tragedy of hindsight is that these signals are only visible after the fact, after the FedEx box has been delivered and the door closed forever. And yet, amidst the pain, there is a story of resilience. Trevor's decision to speak out, to share these intimate details after 12 years, is itself a statement of survival, of reclaiming narrative and agency. For 12 years, he carried this story silently. Now, the world hears it in full color. The shock, the confusion, the betrayal, and the small moments of what once was happiness. And just when you think you have grasped the depth of what happened, we will uncover the most startling truth yet. The reason behind the FedEx box, the method of the vanishing, and the cold, calculated steps that led to one of the most personal betrayals in Hollywood history. It is a story that challenges assumptions, evokes empathy, and leaves you questioning the boundaries between love, loyalty, and ambition. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever met someone and felt, immediately, that they were going to change your life? That every decision, every moment, would somehow be shaped by their presence? For Trevor Engelson, that moment came when he first encountered Meghan Markle. It wasn't a grand, cinematic scene. It wasn't fireworks in the sky or a dramatic, life-altering encounter that you'd see in a movie. It was subtler, quieter, yet utterly intoxicating. There was a spark, a magnetic pull, a sense that she wasn't just another person walking through life. She was someone extraordinary. They met through mutual friends in Los Angeles. It was a casual introduction, the kind of meeting that could have been easily forgotten. But Trevor remembers it vividly. There was a chemistry that defied logic, a kind of instant understanding that you rarely find in adult relationships. They talked about everything: movies, ambitions, family, hopes, and fears. Trevor, at that time, was already a producer with a growing career in Hollywood. Meghan was an actress with a promising trajectory. Both were ambitious, both were passionate, and both were ready to grab life by the horns. From the start, their relationship moved quickly. Whirlwind romances in Hollywood are nothing new, but this was different. There was depth, a sense of commitment that went beyond physical attraction or superficial charm. Friends described them as inseparable. They would attend events together, quietly holding hands in a sea of flashing cameras. In private, they laughed for hours, exchanged ideas, and shared dreams about the future. Trevor speaks fondly of those early days, the joy, the laughter, the sense of building something together. But even in the most perfect beginnings, cracks can emerge. Subtle signs that the foundation might not be as strong as it seems. For Trevor and Meghan, it began with small differences. Differences in communication, in priorities, in the way they approached life and career. At first, they were easy to dismiss, even laugh off. A forgotten text here, a missed call there. But over time, these minor tensions began to add up, like drops of water slowly filling a cup until it overflowed. Trevor recalls one particular evening that, at the time, seemed inconsequential. They had plans for a quiet dinner, just the two of them. Meghan was late. She apologized with a smile, saying work had run over. Trevor, being the understanding partner he was, laughed it off. But there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. A hint of distraction. A trace of preoccupation. Something in the way she spoke, the way she avoided certain topics, that he didn't understand then but would later recognize as the first signs of emotional distance. Despite these early cracks, their relationship seemed, externally, perfect. They traveled together, explored new cities, attended movie premieres, and mingled with celebrities. Every event, every public appearance, was a display of harmony and mutual admiration. Friends would marvel at how effortlessly they fit together, how they seemed to complement each other in every way. But behind the public smiles, there was tension, a subtle undercurrent of ambition and desire that didn't always align. One of the fascinating things Trevor highlights about their early relationship is the balance between love and ambition. Both were driven individuals. Trevor had Hollywood connections, a burgeoning career, and a vision for his future. Meghan, at the time, was carving out her own path, juggling auditions, roles, and personal projects. They shared dreams, yes, but there was always a silent competition, a drive to succeed, sometimes at the expense of the present moment. Audience, think about this. When two ambitious people fall in love, is the relationship strengthened by shared vision or strained by competing priorities? As their romance deepened, Trevor began to notice Meghan's desire for visibility, for recognition beyond their immediate circle. She wasn't content with simply being part of his world. She wanted to build her own, to make her mark, to ensure that she wasn't just known as someone's partner. That ambition, at first, seemed harmless. In fact, it was admirable, but it planted the seeds for future tension. The same drive that made her extraordinary also created distance. And Trevor, deeply in love, didn't fully grasp the implications until years later. Their engagement was a turning point. Trevor describes it as one of the happiest moments of his life. There was joy, excitement, and genuine hope for the future. Family and friends gathered to celebrate, and for a moment, it seemed as if the world had paused just for them. The wedding was planned with care, a celebration of love and commitment. But beneath the surface, the undercurrents of differences in values, communication, and ambition, were still present. Subtle, quiet, but undeniable. During the engagement period, Meghan's career continued to evolve. She landed roles that demanded attention and public scrutiny. She began attending events without Trevor, networking in ways that sometimes left him on the sidelines. At the time, he didn't mind. He trusted her. He believed in their bond. But those small moments, seemingly innocuous, were part of a pattern that would later reveal a greater truth. The very ambition that had drawn them together also had the power to pull them apart. Trevor often reflects on the private moments of their engagement, moments that the public never saw. Intimate dinners, shared dreams, late-night conversations about travel, family, and the future. These were the memories he clung to, even after everything changed. The contrast between the private warmth and the public pressures created a delicate balance, one that would eventually tip. Audience, have you ever experienced a moment where the reality you see publicly doesn't match the private truth? That tension is palpable in Trevor's story. And then came the wedding. A beautiful ceremony, a moment of celebration, of hope, of promises made. Trevor describes walking down the aisle, seeing Meghan in her dress, feeling a surge of love and optimism. Friends and family cheered, cameras clicked, and for that day, everything seemed perfect. But, as we know now, perfection can be an illusion. Beneath the smiles and the ceremonial vows, the seeds of eventual heartbreak were already planted. During those early years of marriage, Trevor noticed small patterns emerging. Moments of distance, subtle prioritization of career over connection, decisions that hinted at a readiness to pivot if opportunities arose. At the time, he didn't recognize these as warning signs. Love can blind even the most perceptive, and Trevor was deeply, utterly in love. He assumed that their bond, built on shared experiences and deep affection, would withstand anything. Audience, consider this. How often do we ignore the small signals, the early warning signs in relationships, because we are convinced love will overcome all obstacles? Trevor's story illustrates this perfectly. He loved Meghan completely, trusted her implicitly, and yet, love alone could not prepare him for what was to come. As their marriage progressed, the external appearances remained flawless. They attended premieres, charity events, and social gatherings together. They laughed, they smiled, they posed for photos that would grace magazines. But behind the carefully curated images, the tension simmered. Ambitions diverged. Priorities shifted. And then, without warning, Meghan made the decision that would shatter Trevor's world. And that decision was not just the end of a marriage. It was an emotional earthquake, the kind that leaves you questioning every moment, every choice, every memory. The kind that makes you wonder how someone you trusted so completely could disappear without a trace. One morning, everything was as it had always been. The next, she was gone, leaving only a FedEx box, a ring, silence. But what exactly led her to make such a drastic choice? Was it career ambition? Was it personal dissatisfaction? Or was there something deeper, something about Meghan's character and mindset that Trevor only understood in hindsight? The answers are complex, emotional, and reveal a side of Meghan Markle that the public rarely sees, a side that would forever alter Trevor's life and reshape the narrative of their marriage. The story of Trevor and Meghan's beginning is not just a tale of romance. It's a story of ambition, trust, subtle warning signs, and the fragile balance between love and personal aspiration. And as we continue, you will see how these early moments, seemingly innocent and full of hope, set the stage for one of the most shocking personal betrayals in recent celebrity history. But what came next? The vanishing, the FedEx box, the abrupt silence, would change everything, and no one could have predicted the emotional fallout that followed. What really happens when the cameras are off? When the red carpets end, the flashbulbs fade, and the public stops watching? What is life like behind closed doors? For Trevor Engelson and Meghan Markle, the private world of their marriage was a mixture of love, ambition, and subtle tensions that would eventually foreshadow the sudden disappearance that shocked Trevor and, later, the world. At first glance, their home life reflected the same harmony as their public appearances. Friends describe evenings filled with laughter, quiet dinners, and weekend getaways that seemed idyllic. There were shared projects, inside jokes, and routines that only couples deeply in love can understand. Trevor often talks about those early nights, curling up on the couch, discussing dreams of the future, watching films, or simply enjoying each other's company without any pressure or expectation. It was in these moments, private and unscripted, that their connection felt strongest. Yet, as anyone in a relationship will tell you, the public image and private reality are rarely identical. Even in the most loving partnerships, tension creeps in. For Trevor and Meghan, these cracks started small. Disagreements that seemed trivial on the surface slowly gained weight over time. They argued about schedules, priorities, and decisions that affected both of their careers. While Meghan was navigating auditions, networking events, and professional commitments, Trevor was establishing his career as a producer. Ambitions, once a point of connection, began to pull them in different directions. Imagine living with someone whose daily reality is intensely public, even if it's only glimpsed by a select few. Meghan's rising profile meant that her professional decisions often dictated their social calendar, their travel plans, and even their personal time together. Small disappointments, an evening missed, a canceled dinner, a delayed conversation, started to accumulate. And while Trevor tried to remain patient, understanding, and supportive, the growing imbalance created a subtle emotional strain that would later become impossible to ignore. Trevor has shared moments where these differences first became noticeable. A minor example, a weekend trip they had planned together suddenly became impossible because of an audition or meeting Meghan prioritized. Trevor remembers feeling hurt, not because he doubted her ambition, but because he felt the distance growing in a space that was supposed to be shared. How do you reconcile love for someone with the frustration of constantly feeling second to their professional life? This is the tension that quietly marked their private world. Beyond the professional tensions, there were emotional differences. Meghan, at times, displayed a level of independence that was admirable yet isolating. She valued her personal space, her career focus, and her autonomy in ways that sometimes clashed with Trevor's expectations of marital closeness. It's a delicate dance, balancing personal ambition with emotional connection. Trevor has admitted that, for a long time, he didn't fully recognize how these differences would shape the trajectory of their marriage. And yet, despite these underlying tensions, there were moments of remarkable intimacy. Trevor recalls nights when Meghan would express vulnerability, discussing her fears about the industry, her hopes for the future, and even her concerns about their relationship. These conversations created deep bonds, the kind that make it almost incomprehensible how someone could vanish without warning. It's this juxtaposition, intimate connection alongside growing emotional distance, that makes the story both fascinating and heartbreaking. Audience, think about the contradictions here. The same woman who shared her deepest fears, laughed at inside jokes, and planned a future with Trevor was simultaneously preparing, consciously or unconsciously, for a departure that would leave him reeling. How do we reconcile love and betrayal coexisting in the same relationship? Trevor's narrative forces us to confront that uncomfortable tension, highlighting that human behavior is rarely linear or predictable. As their marriage progressed, Trevor began noticing patterns in Meghan's behavior that, in hindsight, were significant. She would make career decisions without consulting him, prioritize her personal ambitions, and sometimes seem emotionally unavailable at critical moments. These were not signs of malice, but rather indicators of a focus that sometimes excluded the shared emotional connection. And while Trevor was patient, forgiving, and committed, the seeds of future heartbreak were quietly being planted. One particularly striking aspect of their private life, according to Trevor, was how public perception contrasted with the reality behind closed doors. To friends and colleagues, they seemed like the perfect Hollywood couple, stylish, charming, in love, and effortlessly successful. But behind the walls of their home, there were frustrations, misunderstandings, and moments of silent disappointment. Trevor often reflects on how isolating this duality was, living a life that looked perfect to outsiders while navigating private tensions that nobody else could see. Despite the challenges, there were gestures that indicated deep commitment. Trevor describes spontaneous trips, thoughtful surprises, and moments of genuine affection that reminded him why he fell in love with Meghan in the first place. They celebrated milestones, shared successes, and supported each other's endeavors. It is precisely this blend of love and growing tension that makes the eventual vanishing so jarring. How does someone who shares laughter, dreams, and intimate moments simply disappear? The emotional complexity of their private world is heightened by Trevor's reflections on trust. For him, trust was a cornerstone of their relationship. He trusted Meghan completely, believed in her love for him, and assumed that their bond could weather challenges. Yet trust is fragile, and when combined with ambition, secrecy, and differing priorities, it can be tested beyond repair. The very qualities that made Meghan ambitious, independent, and extraordinary also created distance that, over time, became insurmountable. Audience, here's a question. Have you ever been in a situation where someone you loved deeply acted in ways that were confusing, hurtful, or seemingly contradictory? Trevor's experience is a magnified version of this universal human conflict. It reminds us that relationships are complex, that love does not always guarantee permanence, and that ambition can sometimes overshadow affection in ways that are emotionally devastating. Another element of behind-the-scenes tension was the influence of external factors. Hollywood is an industry rife with gossip, public scrutiny, and subtle pressures that shape behavior in ways outsiders rarely understand. Trevor notes that navigating the public perception while maintaining private intimacy was a constant challenge. Every decision, every event, every appearance carried weight. And while they tried to balance love and career, the scales were never perfectly even. Yet, even in this environment, there were extraordinary moments of connection. Trevor recalls nights when they would discuss not just personal goals, but ethical questions, social issues, and personal philosophies. These conversations reflected a depth that went beyond surface-level attraction, revealing the intellectual and emotional compatibility that had initially drawn them together. But alongside these profound moments, the subtle misalignments continued, quietly foreshadowing the eventual rupture. And then, there were the moments of tension that neither could ignore. Arguments about priorities, disagreements over social engagements, and minor conflicts that hinted at larger differences. These moments, when viewed in retrospect, were signs that the foundation of their marriage was under stress. Yet, love and hope often blinded Trevor to the severity of these issues. How often do we overlook warning signs because we want to believe in the ideal version of a relationship? Trevor's story illustrates this tension perfectly. In private, Trevor often wrestled with questions about what he could have done differently. Could he have communicated more effectively? Could he have anticipated her ambitions? Could he have somehow reconciled their differences before it was too late? These questions haunted him, and for years, the lack of answers amplified the pain. The private world of their marriage, filled with love, laughter, and shared dreams, was also a world where unanswered questions and subtle misalignments festered quietly, setting the stage for a dramatic rupture. And yet, despite all the complexities, it's crucial to understand that Trevor's perspective paints a picture of someone deeply committed, loving, and blindsided by the eventual outcome. The emotional stakes were real, the heartbreak genuine, and the confusion profound. The juxtaposition of love and betrayal, of private harmony and public perception, is what makes this story so compelling. But just as they navigated the delicate balance of private life, Meghan made decisions that would ultimately end the marriage. The departure wasn't sudden without precedent. It was the culmination of growing emotional distance, ambition, and subtle disconnects that had been building behind closed doors. And when the vanishing occurred, the FedEx box, the abrupt silence, the absence of goodbye, it wasn't just a personal loss for Trevor. It was a seismic event that upended everything he had built, everything he had believed, and everything he thought he knew about love. What exactly prompted her final decision? Was it a single moment, a gradual realization, or a combination of ambition and personal desire that led her to leave without warning? Trevor's reflections on these questions reveal a complex interplay of emotions, priorities, and life choices that few outside their private world could ever fully understand. And just when it seemed that their marriage could continue, that the tensions could be managed, the unthinkable happened. Meghan disappeared. But what she left behind, and what Trevor found in the aftermath, would shock not only him but anyone who ever believed in their fairy tale beginning. What does it feel like to be blindsided by the person you love most? To have your entire world rearranged overnight by a decision you never saw coming? For Trevor Engelson, that moment came one ordinary day that would forever be etched into his memory. A day that began like any other, yet ended with a jarring, incomprehensible absence. Trevor recalls waking up that morning, the sunlight streaming through the blinds, the smell of coffee brewing, the sound of life moving normally around him. Meghan was there, as she had been countless times before. They shared breakfast, exchanged plans for the day, and spoke casually about work, friends, and upcoming events. To anyone observing, it was the mundane rhythm of a marriage that seemed steady, solid, and full of promise. But then, everything changed. Trevor left the house briefly, attending a meeting, running an errand. Nothing unusual. When he returned, the apartment was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes your stomach twist. Meghan was gone. Not just out for a short walk or at an appointment. She was gone entirely. No note. No message. No indication of her whereabouts. The only sign of her sudden departure was a package sitting on the kitchen counter. A FedEx box containing the wedding ring he had given her, the symbol of their vows, their commitment, their shared life. Imagine the shock, the confusion, the surge of disbelief. Trevor didn't just feel abandoned, he felt erased. In an instant, the woman he had loved, trusted, and envisioned a future with had disappeared from his life with the cold efficiency of a courier delivery. He describes that moment as surreal, as though he had been transported into a parallel reality where the rules of love, loyalty, and human decency no longer applied. Audience, stop for a second and imagine this scenario. your spouse, your partner, the person you trusted implicitly, is gone without explanation. No words, no conversation, no attempt at closure. How would you feel? Anger? Sadness? Shock? Betrayal? For Trevor, it was all of these emotions simultaneously. The emotional jolt was immediate and total, leaving him struggling to process a situation that defied comprehension. The FedEx box itself became a symbol of the coldness he felt. A package, impersonal, transactional, and devoid of emotion, delivered what should have been a deeply personal farewell. Inside, the wedding ring sat quietly, a silent reminder of promises made and broken. Trevor has spoken about the visceral reaction he had upon seeing it, a mixture of heartbreak, disbelief, and a dawning realization that the life he had known was suddenly over. Why would someone choose this method of leaving? Why avoid conversation, avoid explanation, avoid even a final goodbye? These questions haunted Trevor for years. He had loved deeply, trusted completely, and invested emotionally in a partnership that he believed was enduring. And yet, in one calculated move, Meghan erased not only her presence, but also the acknowledgement of the shared history they had built together. Trevor's shock was compounded by the complete lack of warning. There had been no argument, no sign of dissatisfaction, no verbal hints of impending departure. One day, everything seemed normal. The next, nothing was the same. This abruptness amplified the emotional trauma. In psychology, such sudden loss, especially from someone intimately connected to you, is known to create feelings of abandonment, disbelief, and profound confusion. Trevor's story is a textbook case of emotional shock compounded by betrayal. But there were additional layers to this vanishing act. It wasn't just the absence that hurt, it was the implications. By leaving without conversation, Meghan effectively rewrote the narrative of their marriage. She controlled the circumstances of the end, dictating the terms of separation without regard for Trevor's perspective or feelings. In doing so, she exerted power over the story of their relationship in a way that would reverberate for years. Trevor has described the immediate aftermath in vivid detail. Friends and family called, concerned, trying to understand what had happened. He was left to answer questions he couldn't fully answer himself. There was confusion, frustration, and an overwhelming sense of isolation. The private world he had shared with Meghan, once filled with warmth, laughter, and connection, now felt alien and empty. Even in the midst of this emotional turmoil, Trevor began to notice subtle signs that pointed toward reasoning, however incomprehensible, behind her decision. Timing, he realized, was everything. Meghan's career was on an upward trajectory. Opportunities were appearing that would elevate her status, increase her visibility, and eventually lead to global recognition. While no one could have predicted the exact trajectory, the choice to leave Trevor coincided with moments of professional transition and ambition. It was a convergence of personal desire and external opportunity, a combination that magnified the emotional sting. Audience, pause and reflect. Have you ever been in a situation where timing, opportunity, and personal choice collide in a way that leaves someone else blindsided? Trevor's experience is an extreme example, but the human emotions involved, shock, confusion, heartbreak, are universal. It's this universality that makes the story so compelling. People can relate, even if the celebrity context makes it feel distant. Trevor's narrative also highlights the psychological weight of being ghosted. Ghosting, a term that has become part of modern lexicon, takes on a uniquely devastating dimension when it occurs in marriage. The absence of explanation denies closure, prolongs grief, and complicates emotional healing. Trevor wasn't just experiencing a breakup. He was experiencing erasure. The suddenness and finality of Meghan's departure forced him to confront the fragility of trust, the unpredictability of human behavior, and the harsh reality that love alone is sometimes not enough. In the days and weeks following the disappearance, Trevor attempted to reach Meghan. Calls went unanswered. Messages were ignored. Each failed attempt deepened the emotional wound, reinforcing the sense of abandonment. The FedEx box, once a symbol of their commitment, now represented the cold mechanics of a relationship terminated without empathy or explanation. It was an object that haunted him, a physical manifestation of a vanishing act that defied human expectation. Trevor's story also sheds light on the ripple effects of such a sudden departure. Friends and family were forced to navigate their own confusion and emotional responses. The social dynamics shifted. Shared plans, mutual connections, and intertwined routines were suddenly disrupted. Trevor had to reconcile not only the personal loss, but also the altered landscape of relationships and social interactions that had previously included Meghan. What makes the vanishing even more shocking is the complete lack of context. There was no argument, no crisis, no ultimatum. One day, the marriage existed. The next, it did not. This abruptness challenges fundamental assumptions about human behavior and love. We like to believe that significant actions are preceded by warning signs, by communication, by emotional negotiation. In this case, there were none. The absence itself became the story. Audience, consider this. How would you process an emotional event so sudden, so absolute, that the person you built your life with becomes a ghost in your world? How would you navigate the combination of heartbreak, confusion, and unanswered questions? Trevor's journey in the aftermath of Meghan's vanishing is a testament to resilience, to navigating unimaginable emotional territory, and to the human capacity for both suffering and understanding. And yet, even as he grappled with the shock, Trevor sensed that the disappearance was not random. There was a method, a timing, a pattern that suggested calculation. This wasn't simply a whim or an emotional impulse. It was a decision executed with precision. The FedEx box was the punctuation mark, but the sentence had been written long before that day. The clues had been there, subtle, almost imperceptible, and only now, in retrospect, did they form a coherent picture. The sudden vanishing also left Trevor with practical realities to face. Legal separation, the division of property, and public perception all became part of the fallout. The intersection of personal heartbreak and the external demands of life created a complex web that he had to navigate alone. It was a period marked by introspection, frustration, and the painful process of reconstructing a life that had been abruptly disrupted. And through it all, one haunting question persisted. Why? Why would someone leave love, commitment, and shared history behind in favor of disappearance and silence? Trevor's reflections point toward a combination of ambition, personal desire, and emotional distance, a mixture that created a perfect storm for the ultimate betrayal. But the full story, the context behind her sudden vanishing, the emotional undercurrents, and the shocking revelations about her motives, was far more complex than even Trevor could have initially imagined. What she left behind was more than a FedEx box. It was a series of questions, doubts, and emotional scars that would take years to untangle. And just when it seemed that the impact of her disappearance could not be more profound, Trevor would discover details that would leave him, and soon the world, stunned. The vanishing was only the beginning. How do you process being blindsided by the person you trusted the most? How do you reconcile love, commitment, and shared history with the sudden absence of the one you built your world around? For Trevor Engelson, the days and weeks after Meghan Markle's disappearance were a harrowing blur of heartbreak, disbelief, and confusion, a time when the emotional weight of abandonment pressed down with relentless intensity. Trevor recalls walking into the apartment the day after the FedEx box arrived. The space felt hollow, echoing with silence. Every room, every corner, every object carried the memory of a shared life, now made painfully empty by her absence. The very air seemed charged with the shock of what had happened. How could someone leave overnight? How could someone erase years of connection with such calculated efficiency? These questions haunted him constantly, looping through his mind with no answers. Friends reached out immediately, concerned and confused. Yet their concern often amplified Trevor's feelings of isolation. Explaining the situation felt impossible. The emotional landscape was too complex, the betrayal too deep to communicate in casual conversation. Trevor found himself repeating the facts. She's gone. She left. No explanation. Just a FedEx box. Over and over, hoping that articulation might bring clarity, yet clarity remained elusive. Audience, think about this. Have you ever tried to describe a wound so deep that no words seem sufficient? That's exactly what Trevor was experiencing. The heartbreak was immediate and visceral. Trevor describes the physical sensations, the sinking feeling in his chest, the nights spent lying awake replaying every moment, every conversation, every laugh. He recalls moments when he would walk past the empty bedroom, expecting, almost instinctively, to see her there, only to be met with absence. The human brain craves pattern, closure, and explanation, and when those are stripped away, it creates an emotional vacuum that is both confusing and destabilizing. Compounding the heartbreak was the public perception of Meghan's life. Within weeks, she was back in the spotlight, attending events, building her career, and appearing poised, confident, and unbothered by the personal chaos she had left behind. Trevor had to process not only the personal loss, but also the contrast between his grief and her seeming indifference. The juxtaposition was staggering. How could someone move forward so quickly? How could the person who shared your life appear untouched while you were left to pick up the pieces? There was also anger, of course. Anger at the suddenness, at the lack of explanation, at the audacity of leaving so completely without a conversation. Trevor's anger was interwoven with confusion. He had loved deeply, trusted completely, and believed in the sanctity of their relationship. And yet, in a single act, all of that trust had been rendered meaningless. It's a unique form of betrayal, one that leaves you questioning not just the actions of the other person, but your own judgment and understanding of human nature. One of the most agonizing aspects of this heartbreak was the absence of closure. Trevor didn't just lose Meghan physically. He lost the ability to understand why. Questions like, was it something I did? Was it something I didn't do? And why now? Consumed him. In psychology, this type of ambiguity can prolong grief and complicate the emotional healing process. For Trevor, every unanswered question was a fresh wound, reopened repeatedly as he tried to make sense of the inexplicable. Audience, consider the magnitude of this situation, being abandoned by someone you married, someone you envisioned growing old with, without any form of explanation. The human mind searches for answers, creates scenarios, and imagines possibilities in an effort to regain control. Trevor, like many in similar situations, cycled through countless imagined scenarios, from the rational to the improbable, attempting to fill the void left by her absence. Trevor also recalls moments of disbelief that were almost surreal. Simple tasks, walking through their shared apartment, checking the phone for messages, even making coffee, became exercises in hope that she might reappear, that this was all some bizarre misunderstanding. Every knock at the door, every sound of the delivery truck, every email alert became a potential sign that she had returned, that the vanishing was temporary. But each time, reality reaffirmed itself. She was gone. Adding to the confusion was the contradictory nature of Meghan's prior behavior. She had been affectionate, intimate, and committed, sharing dreams and plans for the future. She had laughed, cried, and confided in him. These memories clashed violently with the stark reality of her disappearance. How could someone act with such closeness one day and leave entirely the next? This contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that intensified Trevor's emotional turmoil. During this period, Trevor's friends became both a support system and a mirror to his confusion. They asked questions, offered advice, and tried to provide clarity. Yet every conversation seemed to loop back to the central mystery. Why? Why would someone leave without explanation, especially after years of intimacy and shared life? Trevor began to realize that the answers might never come, or, at least, not in a form that offered comfort. There was also the social dimension. Mutual friends were suddenly placed in uncomfortable positions, asked to navigate loyalties and allegiances. Some sympathized, some distanced themselves, and some remained neutral. Trevor describes feeling both isolated and scrutinized, as if the world expected him to have answers that he himself lacked. The intersection of personal heartbreak and public expectation created a pressure cooker environment, amplifying every feeling of betrayal and loss. In addition to emotional pain, practical realities demanded attention. Legal separation, division of property, and the unraveling of shared commitments required immediate focus. Trevor had to engage with the logistical aftermath of a marriage that ended not just emotionally, but practically in a single, abrupt act. Every phone call, every meeting, every decision was colored by the shadow of what had occurred. Even amid heartbreak and confusion, Trevor began to piece together subtle clues. Small inconsistencies, Changes in behavior leading up to the vanishing and previously overlooked patterns began to suggest that this departure was not purely impulsive. There were signs of a gradual emotional drift, of priorities shifting, of ambitions growing in ways that might have set the stage for this sudden exit. The realization was both illuminating and painful. The vanishing was the culmination of a trajectory he hadn't fully perceived at the time. Audience, ask yourself, how do you cope when the person you trusted most acts in ways that feel both incomprehensible and deliberate? Trevor's experience illuminates a broader truth about human relationships. Love, trust, and intimacy do not always protect against betrayal, especially when personal ambitions, emotional distance, and timing intersect. The heartbreak is amplified not only by loss, but by the mystery behind it. Trevor's reflections during this period also reveal the emotional isolation that accompanies such a sudden rupture. There were nights spent alone, days where routine tasks became exercises in endurance, and moments where hope and despair collided violently. Every familiar object in the home, photos, gifts, clothing, became reminders of absence. Even mundane routines became reminders of what had been lost. And yet, despite the confusion and heartbreak, Trevor began the slow process of reflection. He questioned, analyzed, and tried to understand the decisions behind Meghan's disappearance. He examined his own behavior, their shared history, and the context of her rising ambitions. It was a painful but necessary step in attempting to reclaim agency over a narrative that had been violently disrupted. But just when he thought he might begin to make sense of the situation, new revelations emerged. Messages, subtle hints, and later insights into Meghan's professional trajectory suggested a motivation that went beyond personal dissatisfaction. A calculated move, perhaps influenced by ambition, timing, and a desire to reshape her life completely. The heartbreak and confusion Trevor experienced were only the beginning. What followed would challenge assumptions about love, loyalty, and human behavior in ways that few could have anticipated. And as he would soon discover, the vanishing was not just an ending. It was a doorway to truths that were even more shocking than the departure itself. The questions lingered. Why did she leave? Was it ambition, personal desire, or a combination of both? Could the marriage have survived under different circumstances? And most haunting of all, was this the true nature of the woman he had loved, or a momentary convergence of choices that led to betrayal? And just when Trevor began piecing together the emotional fallout, he stumbled upon a revelation that would alter his understanding entirely, a truth that exposed the calculated nature of her disappearance and the deeper motivations behind the vanishing. The heartbreak was only the beginning. Have you ever wondered how calculated decisions can masquerade as sudden actions? How someone can erase a relationship, not through anger or confrontation, but through precision and planning? Trevor Engelson soon realized that Meghan Markle's departure was not merely impulsive. It had the cold, almost surgical quality of a choice designed to achieve a very specific outcome. Trevor reflects on the timing, the method, and the absence of warning. Each element seemed intentional. She didn't have an argument with him that morning. There wasn't a fight or even a disagreement that could explain her vanishing. The absence of emotional closure, the FedEx box with the wedding ring, was not random. It was the punctuation of a decision executed with calculated precision. It was the ultimate expression of control, leaving without confrontation, leaving without discussion, leaving with the power firmly in her hands. Audience, stop for a moment and imagine this scenario. Someone you trusted completely, someone you envisioned a future with, carefully plans their exit so that you are left blindsided. No discussion, no reconciliation, no chance to understand, reason, or intervene. How would that feel? For Trevor, it was devastating, not just emotionally but psychologically. It was betrayal that wore the mask of inevitability. What makes this calculated departure even more chilling is the alignment with Meghan's rising career trajectory. At the time of the vanishing, opportunities were presenting themselves, roles, visibility, networking, that would elevate her profile in ways that could redefine her life. Trevor's heartbreak was compounded by the knowledge that her disappearance coincided with professional advancement. It wasn't random. It was perfectly timed, as though every step was considered in advance. Trevor began analyzing the subtle signs he had previously overlooked. the early prioritization of career over shared time. The sudden absences, the late-night phone calls, the focus on events and projects that often excluded him. In hindsight, these weren't minor details. They were threads in a larger tapestry that revealed intent. Meghan had been strategically positioning herself, gradually preparing for a life in which she could step away from the marriage and embrace opportunities that aligned with her ambitions. There's a cruel irony in this type of calculated departure. The person leaving often maintains the illusion of love, care, or emotional attachment until the final act. Trevor describes moments of intimacy and affection that, at the time, felt real and sincere. Yet in retrospect, they were part of a pattern of maintaining connection just long enough to ensure a smooth exit. Audience, consider the contradictions. How can someone show love and simultaneously prepare for abandonment? How can the warmth of a smile coexist with the coldness of a strategic exit? Trevor's story forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about human behavior. The method of departure, the FedEx box, was particularly telling. It was impersonal, efficient, and entirely devoid of emotional acknowledgement. By choosing this approach, Meghan ensured that Trevor could not engage with her directly, could not seek closure, and could not argue or negotiate. The symbolism was stark. She was leaving control of the narrative entirely in her own hands. This wasn't simply a breakup. It was an assertion of power, a demonstration that her choices were sovereign, and that the emotional consequences for Trevor were secondary. Trevor recounts the surreal experience of holding the FedEx box in his hands. The weight of the package felt both literal and symbolic. Inside, the wedding ring, once a token of love, now represented absence, erasure, and the cold mechanics of a decision that had been executed with precision. Every detail of her exit, the timing, the method, the silence, communicated a message. She had chosen her path, and he was no longer part of it. Audience, think about the psychological impact of this. Being abandoned is painful, but being strategically abandoned adds layers of complexity. It challenges your understanding of trust, intention, and human decency. It forces you to question not only the actions of the other person, but also your own judgment in believing that love would be sufficient to sustain a partnership. Trevor's reflections illuminate this brutal reality in ways that are both shocking and deeply human. The coldness of the departure also had ripple effects beyond the immediate emotional trauma. Friends and family, unaware of the underlying calculations, were left to speculate, offer advice, and navigate an uncomfortable social situation. Trevor became the focal point of concern, sympathy, and curiosity, all while he was processing the shock of betrayal. The calculated nature of Meghan's exit amplified his isolation. It wasn't just emotional abandonment. It was social and practical disorientation as well. What makes this story particularly fascinating is the contrast between Meghan's public persona and the private reality Trevor experienced. To the world, she was charismatic, composed, and ambitious, a rising star with poise and purpose. Behind closed doors, she executed a move that was emotionally devastating, yet carefully orchestrated. This dichotomy between public image and private action is central to understanding the psychological impact on Trevor. The precision of her exit made it nearly impossible for him to reconcile love and betrayal, intimacy and abandonment. Trevor began to notice patterns in retrospect. Minor decisions that seemed inconsequential at the time, skipping shared meals, prioritizing work events, maintaining secrecy about professional opportunities, were not isolated incidents. They were threads in a larger narrative that culminated in the calculated vanishing. The meticulousness of her actions suggested foresight, planning, and perhaps even an anticipation of how Trevor would react. This wasn't emotional impulsivity. It was strategy executed with precision. Audience, consider the implications. When someone you love acts in a way that is both deeply personal and calculated, it forces you to confront the nature of their character, the depth of their ambition, and the fragility of trust. Trevor's experience illustrates this vividly. The heartbreak was compounded by understanding that her disappearance was neither sudden nor purely emotional. It was deliberate. Trevor also reflects on the emotional torment of piecing together the motivations behind such calculated behavior. Without a direct conversation, he had to infer intent from actions, timing, and subtle clues. Each inference was painful, revealing layers of strategic planning that made the betrayal sting even more acutely. The absence of direct communication left him trapped in a psychological puzzle, where every answer raised more questions, and every question deepened the emotional wound. Yet, even in the midst of this calculated heartbreak, Trevor began to recognize a difficult truth. Love and trust are not guarantees against ambition or personal desire. Even the deepest emotional connection can be disrupted when one party prioritizes long-term goals over shared intimacy. The cold calculations that led to Meghan's departure were rooted not in malice alone, but in the intersection of personal ambition, timing, and the desire to control the trajectory of her own life. The methodical nature of the vanishing also forced Trevor to confront the idea of closure, or the lack thereof. Traditional breakups, no matter how painful, offer dialogue, understanding, and sometimes reconciliation. Meghan's exit denied him all of that. By executing a silent, calculated departure, she ensured that closure was not possible, that the narrative of the relationship remained partially hidden, and that he was left to navigate the aftermath alone. And as Trevor began to process these revelations, he realized something else. The story didn't end with the FedEx box. The calculated nature of her departure hinted at additional layers, motives, decisions, and priorities that he had yet to fully uncover. There were questions about timing, ambition, and the larger arc of her career that only became clear with hindsight. The coldness of her exit was only the surface of a deeper, more intricate narrative. What made this realization even more devastating was understanding that it wasn't personal anger that drove the disappearance. It was a combination of personal ambition, timing, and deliberate choice. This calculated aspect reframed the entire experience for Trevor. It wasn't simply heartbreak. It was the recognition that he had been carefully removed from a life he thought was shared, while the other party pursued a trajectory that left him entirely outside the picture. And just when Trevor began grappling with this calculated betrayal, he uncovered further evidence, messages, subtle patterns, and career moves that confirmed what he had begun to suspect all along. The vanishing, it seemed, was more than a single act. It was the culmination of planning, foresight, and intention that left him not only heartbroken but fundamentally disoriented. The cold calculations weren't just a story of departure. They were a story of control, of intention, and of ambition intersecting with personal relationships in ways that are both shocking and profoundly human. And as Trevor's revelations continue, the audience will see how this calculated exit set the stage for further shockwaves, emotional turbulence, and the eventual uncovering of truths even more startling than the initial disappearance. The exit wasn't just abrupt. It was precise, deliberate, and unforgiving. But what she did next? The moves she made in her career and life following the disappearance would leave Trevor, and soon the world, stunned. Have you ever experienced a personal crisis so sudden and shocking that everyone around you is forced to take sides, offer guidance, or simply stand by in disbelief? That's exactly what happened when Trevor Engelson was left reeling after Meghan Markle's disappearance. Friends and family were not just observers. They were witnesses to a drama that unfolded with unprecedented intensity, and their reactions reveal another layer of the story that often gets overlooked in celebrity narratives: the human network surrounding heartbreak. Trevor's closest friends were the first to notice something was wrong. Calls started pouring in, messages pinging on his phone with increasing frequency, all asking the same question: where is she? What happened? Trevor, still processing the surreal nature of the event, found himself repeating fragments of the story over and over, each time hoping that saying it aloud might make sense of it. But no matter how often he articulated the sequence of events, the absence of explanation was impossible to reconcile. Friends could offer sympathy, advice, and concern, but they could not fill the gaping emotional void left by Meghan's disappearance. Family members, meanwhile, were equally stunned. For them, it wasn't just a marital conflict. It was an unexpected rupture in a web of trust, love, and shared history. Parents, siblings, and relatives struggled to comprehend how someone could leave so abruptly, without confrontation, and with such apparent disregard for the emotional devastation left behind. Trevor recalls the many conversations with his mother, who attempted to comfort him yet admitted that even she could barely fathom the method of his wife's departure. Audience, think about this. How isolating must it feel when the people you turn to for guidance admit they too are stunned, confused, and almost speechless? Yet amidst the shock, friends began to piece together subtle hints. Small observations, patterns that had previously seemed inconsequential, suddenly gained new significance. Did Meghan seem distant during the last few months? Were there decisions or behaviors that hinted at growing detachment? Trevor and his inner circle began connecting dots that now painted a picture of a